My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 34, and for 14 years my mother introduced me to strangers, cousins, and entire congregations as a waitress. Not an electrician, not the owner of a company with her own father's name on every truck door. A waitress, said with a small, practiced sigh she'd rehearsed in mirrors. Last September, an envelope showed up on my workbench mid-bid on a hospital rewiring job. Heavy cream stock, gold script, smelling like the perfume my mother's worn since before I could spell. Margaret Whitfield, 60 years old, October the 11th, a rented hall, 40 guests, and a version of her daughter she'd spent 14 years inventing from scratch. What she said to me in front of those 40 guests, and what I placed in her hand 30 seconds later, ended a lie that had been running since I was 20. But nobody in that hall knew the real countdown ticking behind the whole evening. 72 hours after that party, my mother was set to lose the house she raised us in, and I was the only person on earth who could stop it. Welcome to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quiet ones stop apologizing for the lives they built in silence, and the truth always finds the fuse box eventually. If any part of this sounds like your family, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe. You're going to want to see how this lands. The invitation sat propped against my toolbox for 6 days before the phone rang. I run an electrical contracting company on the industrial side of Millhaven, 31 employees, 14 vans, 2 school districts, and a regional hospital on the client list. I was mid-bid when my Aunt Ruth's name lit up my screen. Ruth is my mother's younger sister, and the only relative who calls me at work like I actually have one. "Danny girl," she said, "tell me you got the card." I told her I did. "Your mother's turning 60. Whatever this is between you two, bury it for one evening. You can go back to your corners Sunday." I told her I didn't hate my mother. That was true. It was also the most complicated sentence I owned. "Then come early," Ruth said. "The hall's got dead floodlights and the rental company wants $300 just to look at the panel. You're handy." Handy? I quote $500,000 municipal contracts, and to my own family I am handy. I said yes anyway, knuckles white around the phone. Here's the detail that gnawed at me for 3 days straight. The invitation came from Ruth. She addressed it, stamped it, mailed it. My mother never asked for me. As far as I knew, she was entirely at peace with the story she'd been telling since I was 20, that her daughter carried trays downtown, that it was a shame, that some children simply don't turn out the way you hope. I loaded my van that Thursday and drove 2 hours back toward the woman who'd rewritten me from scratch, the radio off, my toolbox rattling in the back like it had opinions about the trip. I passed 3 exits I could have taken toward the shop instead, toward the hospital bid, toward anything that didn't have my mother's handwriting on it. I took none of them. 14 years of practice hadn't taught me to stop going back. It had only taught me to go back armored. To understand what happened at that party, you have to go back to a garage that smelled like flux paste and burnt coffee. My father, Walter Whitfield, was an electrician his whole life. One man, one white van, a reputation across 3 counties for never cutting a corner. I was 11 the first time he let me wire a practice panel bolted to plywood, standing behind me with his arms crossed, while I stripped 14-gauge wire with hands too small for the tool. "Slow as smooth," he'd say, "smooth as fast." Those Saturdays were the finest education I ever got. Electricity is honest, he taught me. It does exactly what the person who installed it deserves. Respect the load. Label everything. Never trust a wire you haven't tested yourself. Once I asked why he never put his name on a bigger sign, and he wiped his hands on a shop rag and said the sentence I've carried like a compass ever since. Load-bearing beams don't ask to be noticed, kid. My mother watched all of this from the porch. She'd set out lemonade and go back inside. In all those years, she never once crossed into that garage. She loved my father, I want to be fair about that, but she loved him in a press shirt, church pew way, and the garage embarrassed her. I thought it was the grease. It took me 20 years to understand it was the calluses. My father died on a Tuesday in March, kneeling in front of a breaker panel at the county fairgrounds. His heart simply stopped at 52. He'd been tired for months and treated it with black coffee, because men built like him don't take mornings off. I was 20, a sophomore in electrical engineering, the first Whitfield to get that far. Then the paperwork arrived, and paperwork tells the truth the way people rarely do. Small insurance. A lien on the van. A second mortgage on the house I'd never heard mentioned. Someone had to work, and my brother Ethan was 23 and buried in pharmacy school, the family's official investment. So one night I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did the math out loud. My mother sat across from me, hands folded. I waited for her to fight me on it. She didn't. She looked at the pad a long moment and said, "Just don't tell anyone at church yet." Not don't do it, don't tell anyone. I withdrew that Friday. What I understand now, and refused to understand then, is that my mother buried two things: that March, her husband, and the version of her daughter she could brag about. Only one got a headstone. For a few years I waited tables at a highway steakhouse, good honest work that kept the lights on. My mother told people I was figuring things out. What I was actually figuring out was an apprenticeship application, filled out on a breakroom table between doubles. At 21, I got in, one of 3 women in a class of 42. I drove home to tell my mother over pot roast, thinking she might be proud. She set down her fork and looked at me the way you look at a stain on good carpet. "An electrician," she said, testing the word like it might be contagious. Yes, exactly like Dad. With Ethan's framed pharmacy acceptance already hanging gold and centered on the wall behind her, she smoothed the tablecloth and said, "In this family, we hang diplomas, not aprons." That sentence held an entire cosmology, and I spent the next 14 years learning its commandments. It's better to look successful than to be solvent. A daughter's job is to be presentable. There's a kind of work this family climbs on, and a kind it climbs away from, and my father and I were always the latter. I tried to correct the record twice. The first time, the year my company landed its first real contract, I mailed my mother a glossy brochure, our fleet lined up, my name at the bottom. It came back 9 days later, unopened, with a sticky note in her looping cursive: "Please stop confusing your aunts." The second time was at my uncle's funeral when a cousin asked kindly if I was still at the restaurant. I was tired, so I told the truth. Company, 19 employees, the new elementary school. My mother materialized out of the casserole line with tears already standing in her eyes. "Dana, honey, please, not today." Then, softer, to my cousin, "She embellishes. It's been hard since her father." You cannot fact-check a crying mother. So I stopped correcting the record and built things instead, quietly. That was my first mistake, and it took 5 more years to invoice me for it. Here's what quiet looked like, stretched over 9 years. Journeyman at 25, master license at 29, the same year I leased a 2-bay garage and named the company Whitfield and Daughter Electric. People assume the name runs father to child. I let them assume it. The truth runs the other way. My father's company died with him at that breaker panel. Naming mine after him was how I dragged it back out of the ground. By last year we were 31 people and nearly $4 million in annual contracts, including one I never mentioned to my mother. First Covenant Church, her church, whose fellowship hall caught fire from 60-year-old wiring. We won the rebuild bid. I stayed off-site, kept the paperwork under D. Whitfield, which everyone reads as a man. My mother sat on that rebuild committee for 3 months, walked past my vans and my crew, and never saw a thing. Ruth told me later Mom bragged about such a professional outfit to her book club. She had no idea she was complimenting her own disappointment. By this fall I had one dream left with a price tag on it. The old Merchants Row building downtown, 10,000 square feet of dead department store I wanted to fill with training benches. The Whitfield and Daughter Trade School, teaching kids like I'd been how to earn a life with their hands. I had $149,000 saved. The letter of intent was drafted. My father's name was finally going up on a wall too big to mail back. That was my October, and sitting in the middle of it was my mother's birthday, like a breaker I didn't want to touch. I arrived in Hazel Grove 2.5 weeks early and checked into the Lakeview Motel, because staying under my mother's roof stopped being an option years ago, and both of us pretend that's normal. Thursday I drove past 214 Delwood Street slow, the way you read an old report card. From the curb the house looked flawless, hedges squared, porch swept, lawn edged like it was drawn with a ruler. But I read buildings for a living. The paint behind the gutters was peeling in sheets. A downspout had rusted through, propped away from the foundation with a paver stone. A 50-cent fix hiding a $5,000 problem. The garage roof had a tarp corner poking out where the street couldn't see it. Aged. Ooze with a perfect face and a rotting spine is a house performing for somebody. I sat in that truck a long minute with the engine ticking, thinking about how many years I'd spent believing my mother's tidiness was proof of something solid underneath it, when really it was the opposite. The tidier the surface, the more desperately something underneath needed hiding. Electricians learn that lesson fast. The prettiest panel covers can hide the worst splices. Friday, at the rental hall, the dead floodlights turned out fine, the wiring feeding them wasn't. Someone had run a cheap extension through an uncovered junction box, the kind of shortcut you take when the real quote scares you. I fixed it in under an hour. But standing on that ladder, I kept circling back to the tarp, the downspout. Somebody in my mother's tidy world had been cutting corners for a long time, exactly where nobody looks. You have to understand what my mother built to understand what she was terrified of losing. Margaret Whitfield is a widow of 14 years who turned widowhood into a full-time occupation. Rebuild committee, book club treasurer, host of the spring brunch with the good china nobody else is allowed to wash. In Hazel Grove, being Margaret Whitfield means something. That woman held it together. Saturday, folding chairs with Ruth, I watched Mom hold court on the walk with Linda Vance, the town's entire radio station with no off switch. That evening, loading Ruth's van, my aunt said, half to herself, 60 years old, God knows how she keeps that house on nothing. I asked what she meant. Ruth got very busy with a chair strap. Your father's insurance, I mean, it wasn't much, she stretches it. Ruth is a terrible liar, always has been. She blushes at the register when she forgets a coupon. I stood in that parking lot with a folding chair in each hand, doing math I did not like, running numbers I had no real figures for yet, just a bad feeling with a decimal point somewhere in it. My brother Ethan showed up Sunday to raise the overflow tent, and Ethan does not do tents. He's a pharmacist 2 towns over, the family's finished product. He hugged me with one arm, told me I looked good, and spent 2 hours being somewhere else, checking his phone the way a man checks a wound. The third call came while we coiled rope, and he didn't walk away fast enough. I caught the cadence, not the words. A scripted, your call may be recorded voice, and my brother answering, I understand. Is there any flexibility on the date? You hear that tone once in your life and never forget it. I'd heard it at 20, negotiating with my dead father's creditors between shifts. Banks don't call pharmacists on a Sunday about prescriptions. I looked at my brother, the good one, the framed one, and had a thought that felt like brushing a live wire. He knows something about this family that I don't. Monday, fixing Mom's porch light, I opened the hallway console drawer hunting for spare fuses Dad always kept there. Muscle memory, 16 years gone, and my hand still knew where to go. The fuses were there, so was the mail. A stack 4 inches thick, rubber-banded, shoved under a church directory. Hazel Grove Federal Savings, over and over. Some opened, some not. The open ones were worse. A home equity line, opened 9 years earlier. Original draw, $85,000. Current balance with interest, $142,000. Past due in red. Minimum payments, then partial payments, then a letter using the phrase maturity date, and a number that iced my chest solid due in full. My mother had been borrowing against my father's house for 9 years. Against the paint she wasn't buying, the roof she was tarping. Borrowing to remain Margaret Whitfield. I walked out to the driveway, held up an envelope, and watched my brother age 5 years standing still. How long have you known? Ethan steered me behind his SUV, like we were 16 again, hiding report cards. Since spring. She missed the payment, panicked, put me on the account as an authorized contact. I've been trying Dana. I refinanced my own car. Then quieter, there's something else. The property taxes, the money you've been wiring me for 6 years. She thinks it's mine. She thinks it's mine. 6 years of my quiet money, and my brother had let our mother believe he was holding the roof up, never once correcting her while she toasted her son the provider and seated me by the kitchen door. You should hate me, he said. I felt something worse than hate. I felt recognition. No, I said, you're just fluent in her language. One envelope in that stack Mom hadn't opened. Certified mail, signed for, then buried under the church directory, which is my mother's entire filing system for reality. We opened it together on his tailgate. Notice of foreclosure sale. The property at 214 Delwood would be sold at sheriff's auction on October 14th. I pulled out the invitation, needing to see both dates side by side. The party, October 11th. The auction, October 14th. My mother was going to celebrate 60 years under lights I'd fixed for free, and 72 hours later the county was going to sell my father's house off the courthouse steps. Tuesday, finishing the porch light while Mom polished silverware for a party she couldn't afford, I tried a soft opening. Big house for one person. A friend of mine downsized last year. Best decision she ever made. I'm not moving to a condo, Dana. She set the spoon in its velvet slot like she was laying it to rest. Do you know what this town would say if Margaret Whitfield sold her house? This family hangs diplomas, not aprons, and it does not hang for sale signs. There it was, the whole religion, unchanged since the pot roast 14 years earlier. Not cruelty. Doctrine. She'd rather drown quietly than be seen swimming hard, because in her world, being seen trying is the drowning. That night, Ruth found me at the motel with ginger ale and the truth. You know, she was almost a nurse, top of her class downstate. Then Ethan came along a little ahead of schedule. Our mother packed her dorm room into the station wagon and got her a cashier job, told her married girls with babies don't need diplomas. Ruth turned the can in her hands. When Margaret cried, and she cried for a week, our mother said, a diploma is the only thing they can't take away from you. Now you'll never have one. She's been trying to graduate ever since. Through Ethan, through the committees, through whatever this thing is she does with you. I finally saw the wiring. My grandmother had driven a sentence into a 22-year-old like a nail into wet concrete, and 38 years later that girl was still standing in its exact shape. My mother wasn't the author of the story eating us alive. She was its longest-running victim. She just never stopped charging admission. Back in the room, I made 2 columns on a legal pad. Left, the Merchants Row building, 149,000 saved, my father's name finally going up on a wall. Right, a foreclosure balance north of 140,000, interest still running. The 2 numbers stared at each other like they already knew. I called my attorney Priya at 9 that night. Forget the auction, she said. If the bank's holding that note 9 years past origination, they don't want the house, they want it off their books. We don't buy the house, Dana, we buy the debt. Take assignment of the mortgage, cancel the sale. Clean, legal, fast. My father's voice climbed up through 14 years of floorboards. Load-bearing beams don't ask to be noticed, right, Dad? But maybe hiding was never humility. Maybe it was just a smaller shape of shame. Before I tell you what I decided, if you've ever quietly paid a bill for somebody who was ashamed of you, tell me in the comments. Because for years, I thought I was the only one holding up a house from the cheap seats. I decided the house does not sell on the courthouse steps. Not that house. And I decided this wouldn't be the old way, 6 years of tax money laundered through my brother's good name, love disguised so it would be allowed through the door. This time it would carry my real name. Wednesday, 13 days before the auction, Priya called the bank and offered cash for the note through W&D Holdings, an entity we'd used for years, boring on purpose. Small banks hate foreclosures. By Thursday they came back with a payoff figure, $149,000, covering balance, interest, and legal costs. Sign within 48 hours. The Merchants Row seller wanted his answer by Friday too. 2 doors, 1 key, and the key was every dollar I had. Send the papers, I said. Friday morning, I made 2 calls in a deliberate order, because if I'd made them the other way, I might not have made the second one. First, I withdrew my letter of intent on the trade school. The broker was decent about it, said the building had waited 80 years, it could wait a little longer. 10,000 square feet of my father's name, gone in a bank parking lot. Then I called Priya, wire it. $149,000, my trade school fund down to the studs. At 11:42 my phone buzzed, wire confirmed, no music, a parking lot, a text message, and on the other side of it a different world. W&D Holdings now owned the note on 214 Delwood Street. The sheriff's sale was canceled that same afternoon. My mother had no idea, the trade school was gone, and there was no undoing any of it. I sat in the truck a long while. I'd like to tell you it felt noble. Mostly it felt like giving blood, necessary, draining, quieter than you'd expect. Saturday, I made the mistake of driving past Merchants Row on my way home. The lockbox still hung on the door. My foreman, Marcus, caught me in the yard and asked when we were signing, since half my crew had already volunteered to teach evenings. I looked at him and heard myself say, "Not this year." He didn't push. Good foreman read faces like blueprints. I ate dinner standing at my kitchen counter that night, 34, richer than my whole family tree on paper, owning approximately nothing again. I laughed once, out loud, at the shape of it. Then I drove back toward Hazel Grove because there was still a party coming. I had to reconstruct the next part afterward, from Ethan and Ruth, the way you piece together an outage from scorch marks. Monday, 5 days before the party, my mother opened her mailbox and found the notice from W&D Holdings. The note assigned to a new holder, the sale canceled pending review. To me, that letter was mercy in an envelope. To my mother, it was a shark fin. She called Ethan twice before noon. "Nobody buys a stranger's trouble out of kindness," she told him, and you should sit with the fact that she believed that with her whole heart, because it explains everything about the house I grew up in. Wednesday night, Ethan pulled up the county recorder's site. Assignments of mortgage are public record, and pharmacists are excellent at fine print. The signature under the notary block, Dana Whitfield, member. He called me at 10. "W&D, he said. "Whitfield and daughter, you bought Mom's mortgage, flat as a hallway." "With what?" "The school money," I said. "There it is," he said, and laughed the way you laugh in a hospital. Then, "You have to tell her or she'll find out from the paperwork and it'll be the funeral all over again. She'll say you did it to humiliate her." "I'll tell her after the party," I said. "She paid enough for it." 3 days, Dana. The night before the party, I watched my mother dress rehearse for an audience of folding chairs, adjusting place cards a quarter inch at a time. I found my own name at table 6, by the kitchen door, between a great uncle's hearing aid and the coffee station, where you seat the caterer's cousin. I nearly drove home. Instead, I went out to my truck and took my father's old multimeter from the toolbox, yellow case soft at the corners, his initials scratched into the back. I slid it into my jacket like a saint's medal. Then I took one business card from the console, not a trophy, a key. Some doors you knock on, some you rewire. The hall looked genuinely beautiful, and I say that as the person who fixed its floodlights and knew what the wiring looked like under the makeup. Gold tablecloths, hydrangeas dressed up to look florist-bought, 40 guests in their church best, Linda Vance positioned dead center like a satellite dish, angled to catch every signal in the room. My mother moved through it like a woman with no unopened mail anywhere on earth. 60 looked good on her. Navy dress, pearls, hair set that morning at the salon she couldn't afford but never once skipped. She laughed at exactly the right volume. She touched elbows exactly the right number of seconds. She was being Margaret Whitfield harder than I had ever watched her be Margaret Whitfield, like a woman running a marathon on a sprained ankle and daring anyone to notice the limp. Only twice did I catch the current underneath it. Once when the pastor asked after the house and her smile held half a second too long, stretched thin as old wire insulation. Once when she glanced at the door every time it opened, like she was expecting a process server with a bow on him. She was 60 years old and terrified in pearls, and I was the thing under her bed, standing by the coffee station with her debt folded into my jacket pocket like a live round. Ruth swung by table 6 with 2 plates and parked herself beside me, uninvited, which is Ruth for I love you. "Behave," she said, watching Mom work the room. "Always do," I told her. She snorted into her sweet tea and didn't believe me for a second, and she was right not to. After the toasts, my mother did the thing she does at every gathering, the tour of accomplishments. My son Ethan, doctor of pharmacy, his wife, the grandchildren, gifted, obviously. It went on, warm and practiced, and I watched her sail toward table 6 the way you watch weather cross a field. She looked at me, really looked, and something moved behind her face. Then she reached for the oldest tool on her belt, raised her glass a fraction, and said, in exactly the voice you'd use for It's a Shame About the Rain, "And this is Dana, the one who didn't finish college." Somebody's husband chuckled before he could catch it. 40 faces did the polite thing, which is nothing, which is worse. I felt the old heat climb my neck, 14 years of it. And then, I swear to you, it just stopped, like a breaker doing the one job it was built for. I stood up, not fast, not theatrical. I stood the way you stand when it's your stop. I walked the length of 2 tables, Linda Vance tracking me like sonar. My mother's chin came up, braced for a scene. I didn't make one. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said, and set the business card gently in her free hand. I watched R read it once and not understand it, then watched it land in stages, dominoes tipping in slow motion. Whitfield and Daughter Electric. The green letters she'd walked past for 3 months at the church. W&D Holdings. The letter buried in her drawer. The canceled auction. Her eyes rose to mine, and I watched 60 years of certainty try to reorganize itself around a business card, and fail, and try again. Her wine glass slipped from her hand and burst against the hardwood, and 40 guests turned at once, and my mother stood in the wreckage of her own toast with my name in her fist. I leaned close. "We should talk in the kitchen, Mom." The kitchen was steel counters and borrowed quiet, caterers' trays steaming under foil. My mother came apart in layers. First denial: "You do not own an electrical company, Dana, you wait tables." Then fear, eyes on the door. "Is it you that bought?" She couldn't say mortgage. "My house." "Yes," I said. "It's been me for a while, Mom." Then the layer beneath all the others. Her chin shook. "You waited 14 years to," she stopped, and what fell out next didn't even sound like her voice. Older, flatter, borrowed from a dorm room she'd been packed out of 38 years earlier. "They take everything from you eventually. The only thing they can't take is the—" She caught herself on the word diploma, like a woman catching herself on a stair rail. I laid the papers on the counter, one at a time, the filing that canceled the sheriff's sale and a lease. 214 Delwood Street, tenant Margaret Whitfield, term, life, rent $1 a year. "Nobody's taking your house. I bought the debt, all of it. It was done last Friday before you ever hung a streamer. Out there tonight, nothing happens, no announcement. As far as this town knows, the bank made an arrangement and Margaret Whitfield is fine. I'm not here to take your kingdom." I put my hand flat on the papers. "It cost me the school, Mom. There was going to be a school with Dad's name over the door, and I emptied it into this house instead. So you'll never owe me $1, and you'll never hear about it again. But you owe me one sentence." She went very still. "Look at me, not the door, and say it out loud. My daughter builds things. She didn't finish college. She didn't need to." She tried twice before it came. The first attempt died at my daughter. The second made it to builds and drowned. Then my mother, 60 years old that very day, pearls trembling, my card still folded in her fist, looked me in the eye and said it slowly, like a woman walking across ice. "My daughter builds things," a breath. "She didn't finish college." Barely above a whisper, "She didn't need to." Her face flinched around that last part, as if the sentence had edges. I suppose it did. It had spent half a lifetime filed down to a point, aimed the wrong direction the whole time. She didn't fall into my arms. There was no swelling music, no movie moment embrace over a steel prep counter. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many of these stories promise you the hug at the end, and real reconciliation is quieter and stranger than that. She wiped under one eye with a knuckle, straightened, and smoothed the lease flat on the counter, squaring its corners with both hands, making even her surrender presentable, the way she'd square a tablecloth or a seating chart. Some habits don't break just because the walls around them finally do. "Don't tell them tonight, let me tell it my way." "That's the difference between us, Mom," I said, no blade in it, just the plain fact at last. "I never needed them to know." Somebody had swept up the glass. Near the end of the evening, unprompted, my mother finished the introductions properly. "My daughter Dana," she said, and the flicker went the other way this time. "She owns her own company. She's very good." It wasn't the whole sentence, but it was the first brick out of the wall, and I sat back down at table 6, lighter than I'd been in 14 years. By December, here's the honest accounting. The lease is signed and recorded. My mother lives at 214 Delwood for the rest of her life, at $1 a year. The first thing I did as her landlord was send a crew to fix the downspout, the garage roof, every corner-cut circuit in that house. Invoice addressed to the owner, which is to say to me. The town found out anyway, but the story played backward from the one she'd feared her whole life. The church ladies weren't scandalized, they were floored. At Sunday coffee hour, women who'd watched my mother perform since before I was born gripped her hand and said, "Margaret, what a daughter." My mother, I have this from Ruth under oath of ginger ale, got a strange look, then straightened her spine. She's always been gifted with her hands. For Margaret Whitfield, that's roughly a ticker tape parade. At Thanksgiving, I sat at the main table. Nobody mentioned it. She introduced me to a visiting cousin. My daughter, the electrician. She owns the company. Then, unable to help herself, she could still finish her degree online someday. I let it drift by like weather. A sentence like my grandmother's doesn't die in 1 October, it just doesn't get to collect rent from me anymore. Ethan sends a check every month now, small, unasked. The first came with a note that didn't hide behind school photos. Payment 1. For the taxes. I should have carried the name too. We had a long talk in his driveway in November, both of us leaning on his SUV like it was the old tailgate. He's fluent in her language, my brother, but he's learning mine. Merchants Row sold in December to a self-storage outfit, and I allowed myself one slow drive past. Because somewhere between the motel legal pad and my mother's kitchen counter, I understood I'd been waiting to start the school the way she waited to be seen. Grandly, all at once, with a building worthy of the announcement. That was her religion talking through me, so we started small instead. In February, we glassed off the back corner of my own shop and hung a sign my foreman welded in his garage. Whitfield and Daughter Training Annex. 6 benches, 6 students, nights and Saturdays. One of them, a 19-year-old named Brianna, strips 14-gauge wire with her jaw set exactly the way mine used to. My father's multimeter sits on the shelf above her bench, still dead accurate. The first thing I teach every one of them is the first thing that ever made sense to me. A breaker trips to save the house. Cutting the current isn't failure. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and watching the whole structure burn. I tell them about a garage that smelled like flux paste. I don't tell them all of it, not yet, not the pot roast, not the sticky note, not table 6. Some of it they'll have to earn the hard way, same as I did, but I tell them enough. That the trade doesn't care what your last name sounds like at a funeral. That a panel doesn't check whether you finished college before it lets you make it safe. That the people who taught you to be ashamed of your hands were almost always ashamed of something else first, and you just happened to be standing closest when it went looking for somewhere to land. Brianna asked me once, late on a Saturday, why I named the annex the way I did instead of just calling it after myself. I told her the truth, because the name was never about me. It was about a man kneeling in front of a breaker panel who never got to see what his daughter built with what he taught her, and a woman on a porch with a lemonade pitcher who spent 60 years afraid of exactly the thing that finally saved her. My father used to say load-bearing beams don't ask to be noticed, and he was right. But I'd add this, from the far side of that October, the day I stopped hiding inside my own drywall was the day the whole house finally stood up straight. A business card, a broken glass, one sentence it took my mother 60 years to say out loud. If this sounded like your family, if you've ever been somebody's quiet wall, somebody's table 6, tell me your version in the comments, because I read every single one, and there are more of us holding up more houses than anybody knows. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, because the quiet ones always have the best stories, and we are nowhere near finished telling them.